gathered. You grew up nice and sheltered with mama's pretty stories and your own made up fury. And mama gave me a magic clicker. Well, yes, I think it's true and fair to say. Come on in and listen. Lost words you've been missing. Now the fire you're bearing, the eye of the darkness you're lying. So you were drawn to stories early on. My dreams would light up my imagination, and you had nightmares night and day. Yeah, but with the clicker I chased those frights away. Ooh, you, so true. So here is the clue of hope to remember. Visions, they come true. Bend the light switch too. Show me the champion of light. I'll show you the herald of darkness. Lost in the never-ending night. Diving deep to the surface.
Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's talk about Alan Wake. Dead by Daylight is a game that's built down to its core on nostalgia, on reverence for age-old horror tropes and fiction that have stood the test of time and inspired generations of creatives. Classics of the genre like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Friday the 13th and Silent Hill inspired many of Dead by Daylight's motifs, themes and characters. And after the success of the Halloween chapter, many of these classics of horror history have found their way into the fog in their own right, creating a veritable hall of fame of horror. But something new has arrived in the fog, and it's got me very excited. The arrival of Alan Wake into Dead by Daylight is the first real display of something many DBD players, myself included, have been asking for a very long time. A willingness to include licensed characters from newer modern horror properties with perhaps a slightly more niche appeal than the classic names and icons of the 21st century. To be clear, I don't think Alan Wake is exactly a small independent game. Both games have received huge critical acclaim and sold over 1 million copies apiece. But I think it's fair to say that next to massive genre-defining names like Freddy Krueger, Chucky and Nicolas Cage, Alan Wake is a bit of a small fish in a very large pond. And before we even look at the quality of the adaptation, I have to say this is a wonderful sign for the longevity of Dead by Daylight, and it's especially good for dedicated horror fans among the player base who have by and large had to live with the fact that their special Scrimbo Bimblo from a new or fairly niche piece of horror media is never going to end up in DBD. Those of us pining for Art the Clown, Megan, Pearl, Gabriel, or even the Cocaine Bear from the hit movie Cocaine Bear have a little bit more hope than we did before, because Alan Wake has shown us that you can be a modern horror license without decades of goodwill behind you and still make it into DBD's lineup. At least without having to be one of the biggest pop culture sensations in the 21st century. Alan Wake doesn't have the sheer public brand recognition of franchises like Alien, Child's Play or Resident Evil, not because it lacks quality, it really doesn't, but because it lacks history. It hasn't yet had time to stand the test of time. And as such, adding Alan Wake to Dead by Daylight represents a willingness to be a little more experimental with their licensed collaborations, something I heartily hope we see more of in the future. But this isn't the only reason why I'm so enthusiastic about Alan Wake's arrival into Dead by Daylight, because I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Alan Wake is the best licensed survivor we've ever had. Sorry Yoichi, get off your throne. Nick Cage, you didn't really count anyway. Alan Wake is pretty much a perfect licensed survivor, and whatever licensed survivors we get in the future, especially if they're solo releases like Wake, should really be held up to Alan's standards in terms of authenticity and faithfulness to the source material. Before I talk about why, I want to tell you a couple of important things. First of all, I'm still fairly new to the Alan Wake series. While I'd heard good things about it and had a vague idea of what to expect, I didn't start playing the games until the chapter got announced. And I'm finishing Alan Wake 2 while the script is in production, so I'm not exactly a veteran of this series, so if I've made a mistake somewhere then that's probably why. But also this video will contain spoilers for both the Alan Wake games, so if you haven't played either of them then I strongly recommend you do so. They're both really great games and definitely worth your time. So let's start with a simple question for the uninitiated. Who even is Alan Wake? Alan Wake is a best-selling writer known for his Alex Casey series of detective novels, who starts the events of the first Alan Wake game with a very nasty case of writer's block, and his wife Alice decides to help this by taking them both to the sleepy little town of Bright Falls, Washington, where the two would stay at a cabin on Cauldron Lake where they could unwind and maybe Alan could start writing again. But an unseen evil force kidnapped Alice Wake and dragged her into the lake. And when Alan drove in to save her, he resurfaced to find the whole cabin gone. Not destroyed, but vanished like it never even existed. This begins the story of the first Alan Wake game, and sets the tone for the series as a whole. The dark presence under Cauldron Lake distorts the town of Bright Falls around it, causing reality's laws to become inconsistent and people and animals to become possessed by it, turning into the shadowy Taken that fear nothing but the light. Side note, the Taken in the first game are really fucking goofy. They got these voice filters like Deadites and Evil Dead, and I just can't take them seriously. I'm sorry. The events of Alan Wake follow our elbow patch-clad leading man trying to save his wife from the dark presence that kidnapped her. And as Alan finds manuscript pages he seems to have written of a novel that he never actually started, the truth of what's going on at Bright Falls becomes apparent. The dark presence of Cauldron Lake has the power to turn fiction written near the lake into reality. And most of the story of Alan Wake follows the manipulation of the dark presence as it tries to convince Alan to write the story that will free it. He writes a manuscript with the intention of using it to save Alice, but in doing so the dark presence could use it to escape and terrorise the world with its reality warping powers. And to the presence's credit, it almost succeeds. It's not as easy as Alan sitting at his typewriter and scribbling down the words, and then all of a sudden the dark presence shit itself so hard it died, and Alan and Alice rode off in the sunset together. Because while Cauldron Lake turns fiction into reality, the fiction still has to be somewhat plausible and watertight for things like plot holes and internal inconsistencies. Break the rules of storytelling too hard and the dark presence can leverage that against you. But Alan finds a way to outwit it, writing his wife's escape into the story at the cost of trapping himself inside his writer's room in the dark place under Cauldron Lake, sealed away in a battle of wits with the dark presence until he can write his way out. First things first, I'd like to say something about the kind of game that Alan Wake is. The first Alan Wake definitely provides plenty of narrative food for thought as his mystery unfolds, and the writing is far and away the best part of the game. Finding manuscript pages that both inform your decisions through gameplay and allow you to potentially piece together the dark presence's schemes ahead of time makes exploring the mysteries of Bright Falls feel super rewarding, and the disorienting jump between settings in Bright Falls sells the fragmented nature of Alan's life now that the rules of reality are in heavy flux and being constantly rewritten by Alan and the dark presence. Unfortunately, the repetitive gameplay and combat mechanics form a little too much of the game to make it truly stand out to me, especially when compared to the sequel, but there's no denying how the core of Alan Wake shines through despite this. It feels like a successor to Silent Hill in that regard, especially Silent Hill 2, and this is where we start to see how Alan Wake melds so well into Dead by Daylight. While the first Alan Wake game isn't what I would call a horror game per se, the role the Dark Presence plays as an external and alien corrupting influence attempting to push its way into the world and seizing people to become its playthings is obviously similar to the Entity. But the narrative compatibility between Alan Wake and Dead by Daylight does not stop there. Alan Wake's core theme really is the relationship between fiction and reality, what can happen when that line becomes blurred, and the effect that the creative process has on the creative mind, the person writing the story and why they're writing it, how one story can get away from you and take a life all of its own. This has been a recurring part of DBD's story for years now, pretty much as old as the tome system itself, but for the most part I wouldn't blame the casual player who doesn't read the tome stories for not realising this. For as long as the Observer has been part of DBD's stories, it's been stated that while the Entity is concerned, the boundary between fiction and reality is pretty thin, and that creative minds in the real world will sometimes get visions from alternate universes or from within the fog itself that will go on to inspire their creative works, especially if these people are traumatised or otherwise sensitive to the Entity's presence. What's real in one universe can therefore unwittingly inspire fantastical stories written in another universe, by a writer who's effectively seen them happening without even knowing it. And while this is usually relegated to the background details and DBD storytelling, there's a couple of characters that have been released over the years that play directly with this concept, and result in Alan's story in Dead by Daylight feeling like a natural extension of both games' narratives. But we'll talk about them later. What's actually in Alan's DBD lore to begin with? We'll start with his base story and then we'll move on to the tome that he got, because Alan's a very lucky boy and is the first character DBD has ever had to have a tome released at the exact same time that he was. Most characters at least have to wait until their mid-chapter to get a tome, but Alan released in his own mid-chapter, so he gets to have a tome literally on day one. That's why this video isn't out on release, by the way. I wanted to read Alan's tome first before I wrote the video, which necessitated waiting for his full release, rather than using the lore that I could read on the PTB. Alan Wake in Dead by Daylight comes from a slightly ambiguous time between the first and second Alan Wake games. During the 13 years Alan was held prisoner in the Dark Place, as part of his gambit to save his wife. The story draws on Alan's established backstory. In the first game, it's told to us that he wrote for Night Springs, a TV series in the vein of The Twilight Zone, which gave him the springboard into becoming a published author. As part of his plan to escape the Dark Place, Alan attempted to draw upon a script he wrote for an episode of Night Springs, where a group of plucky protagonists escape from a nightmare world shrouded in fog. Maybe if he could write that again, he could use the same way out that they did to escape the Dark Place for good, bringing their story into reality, and weaponizing the Dark Place's ability to bring fiction to life to allow him to escape its clutches. Basically creating a door for his characters and then using that door to get himself out. But there's one teeny tiny little problem. Alan can't quite remember how the story ended, and without the ending, the whole exercise is worth nothing. So he hits the typewriter, iterating again and again, but unable to remember the ending until the truth comes to him. He had left the ending ambiguous. Did the protagonist end up escaping the monster, or wind up somewhere even worse? While Alan couldn't remember how he intended to end the story, this was better than nothing. As his typewriter keys clacked out the final draft of the script and the fog encroached into his writer's room, he felt a throbbing uncertainty. Maybe this could have done with just one more draft. But in the gloom of the Dark Place, he saw it, a glimmering light in the fog, and he stepped out to freedom. Well, when I say freedom.
I hold out hope that one day the fog will part. To illuminate my next chapter.
And thus the entity claimed Alan Wake for its own. First things first, you'll notice that Alan's lore is much more in-depth than most licensed characters get. Look at a character like Laurie Strode or most of the Resident Evil crew, for example, and you'll see that their lore is basically a post-it note, a brief summary of their life before the arbitrary point the license holder decided they were taken by the entity. Perhaps fitting for a storyteller in a story-based game about stories, Alan Wake is given much more, story. Rather than dedicating the entire story introducing people to the character, Alan's story fills in a massive and naturally occurring gap in his narrative without skimping on basic character info, meaning that a total newcomer to Alan Wake can still get something out of his story, while a long-time fan of the series gets a part of the long, elaborate story of Alan Wake, filled out in an interesting way. And since it includes no information from Alan Wake 2, it means that if you haven't played that game yet, you can still do so without being spoiled by the lore. If every licensed story was written this way, I'd be a much happier guy whenever we got a new licensed chapter. And while I know Behaviour's not got that much control over what their licensed partners let them do with their stories, I wish Alan Wake could be the new standard of storytelling for licensed characters in the future, because it really is just what the Doctor ordered. The Doctor here is me in like the foil he will even care. I particularly appreciate the callback to Night Springs and Alan's time working for it that lets Alan start to work on a method of escape. While Night Springs isn't a major part of Alan's life and he's well and truly moved on from that by now, it's present enough in both Alan Wake and Control, which is set in the same universe and has several characters in common with the Alan Wake series, that seeing it become a big part of Alan's DBD story feels very natural, especially given that DBD is a horror game, and once he became famous, Alan wasn't really known for his horror work as much as his detective work on the Alex Casey novels, so pulling from his past as an established horror writer is a real no-brainer. And the idea of Alan trying to use his existing fiction to leverage his way out of the realm is a great parallel to the entity's typical relationship with creative minds. Rather than the entity showing real events within the fog to writers outside it who then turn it into fiction, Alan is trying to turn fiction into real events. But it gets a little bit deeper if you read the Observer section to Tome 3, which alludes to something called the Trinitarian of Creation. The Trinitarian of Creation dictates that in places that are high in auric particles such as the entity's realm, Fiction can become reality by combining an idea with consciousness to shape the world around you. It's how the observer was able to keep himself safe in his tower for as long as he did, using the aorist to focus these ideas and his own consciousness to create physical objects. The method by which Alan turns his stories into reality seems to be similar. He combines his ideas with the immense malign consciousness of the Dark Presence, and with the glue of plausibility and standard genre tropes holding it all together, his ideas become reality. And to me, this is the core of what makes Wake's inclusion to DBD feel so seamless. Alan Wake's central theme is the relationship between the story and the storyteller, between fiction and reality, and DBD's lores had those same themes for years. Something which we'll get to see even better when it comes to the Alan Wake tome. Speaking of which, when it was first leaked, I didn't really know what to expect when I heard Alan Wake was getting a tome, but I knew if it was anything other than great, I'd be really quite annoyed, because there's a huge backlog of survivors who haven't received tomes yet, many of whom are some of my favourite survivors ever. But let me tell you now, Alan Wake's story is a banger. It really is. I know it's not technically out yet, but thanks to those lovely fellows at DBD Leaks, we have all the stories for Deathslinger, Alan Wake, and the House of Arkham already data mined and uploaded to dbdinfo.com. The link to that is in the description if you're at all interested in taking a look for yourself. Alan Wake's tome goes into what happens in his base lore with a lot more detail, rather than picking up a point in his life before the events of the games. It instead chooses to put a magnifying glass on Wake's time in the fog and how he got there. I think this approach could only have worked for a character like Alan, and only in a situation where his release of the tome comes out. Alan's life's already covered so extensively in Remedy's games and other media that doubling down and exploring DBD's specific version of Alan makes sense. But if we were forced to wait a while for the character to get a tome, only to get this that only develops the base lore, I think it would probably have felt like a pretty hollow story. Huntress's tome is a great example of a story written this way. It's a passable enough story that doesn't tell us anything we don't already know, making it feel like a waste of time to read. Wake, on the other hand, has his base lore built on in a really intelligent way that makes the best use possible out of DBD's setting and the unique characteristics of Alan's life and the way he wound up in the fog. As soon as I started reading the tome, it hit me how different this one was from most normal tome entries. If you've played the Alan Wake games, you'll notice that Alan has a particular narrative voice, both in his manuscript and in the dialogue as he talks to himself throughout the games. His dialogue is in first person, heavy on descriptive language and laden with simile and metaphor to convey meaning, as he puts the language skills of a best-selling author to use expertly. This is quite different from the typical writing style of the tomes, where our main character is typically being watched by an external observer, and our insight into their feelings and thoughts are more limited, expressed most often through shorter sentences and less descriptive language that more concisely reflect the state of mind of the tome subject. Additionally, the normal log number that any given tome memory has, including Deathslinger's and his new story for this tome, is absent for the Wake story, affirming that this isn't the observer or someone else who's taken over his tower exploring Alan's memories, but the writings or internal monologue of Alan himself, something that already set the tome apart from others in a way that only strengthens it. Wake's story explores the Night Spring script he was working on in more detail, and affirms something that the base lore implied about the characters and the events that took place in it. The Night Spring script stars 4 characters: Eloise, Adrian, Darren, and Michelle, trying to escape a mysterious, shapeless being known as the Dread. And if these names have started to look a bit familiar to you, then congratulations, you're paying attention. Alan's story bears an uncanny resemblance to the goings-on in the trials down to the characters involved. They even act the way you'd anticipate. Eloise takes command of the group in difficult situations, Darren is kind of a load, Adrian is supportive but doesn't necessarily always get it right, and Michelle has arcane knowledge that helps the team when she hasn't lost her glasses. Alan is using these characters to prod and probe at the limits of the dark place as he tries to figure out how they escaped. But he runs face first into a problem that handily answers a question many players have had frustrations with since the first Alan Wake game. Why can't Alan just write, and then Alan escaped and had a wonderful life while the Dark Presence was exiled to Birmingham until the end of time? And while the answer is made pretty clear in the Alan Wake series, I love that this story reaffirms the fact that what Wake writes has to be plausible and internally consistent, and not rely on contrivances or deus ex machina to conclude the story. Best case scenario, situations like this in the fiction can result in it not coming true. And the worst case scenario, Mr. Scratch, Alan's sadistic and evil alter ego, can use these narrative weaknesses as literal weaknesses to escape into the real world, and Wake isn't ready to risk that. When Wake recalls how he ended the Dead of Night script, he encounters this problem. It turns out his original ending for the Night Springs episode was kind of ass, and his showrunner had a go at him for ending the story with a solution that he more or less pulled out of his ass to give his characters a happy ending. It still has to be a good and internally consistent story, and that's the problem Wake is having, compounded by the clouding that Dark Presence inflicted on his memory. This is a plot element taken straight from Alan Wake 2. When he finally escapes the dark place, Alan is a wreck, mentally drained and borderline gibbering upon his return to the real world, because 13 years of solitary confinement with an eldritch being that hates you really did a number on his memory and his sanity. But when he finally figures out that the Night Springs episode had an ambiguous ending, Wake is exuberant. He finally got the way out that he wanted, even if it might not necessarily work, and as he writes the final draft you can notice the perspective beginning to slightly shift. The story goes from a first-person internal monologue to a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective, similar to the prior tomes, which makes sense since Alan's period of introspection and planning is well and truly over. His time of sitting back trying to write his way out of the dark place is done. He's escaping, one way or the other. He steps into the story, staring down the dread in the place of his characters and running into the dark fog, seeking the same ending that his characters got. Freedom from the horrors of the dead of night, and a snowball's chance in hell of seeing his wife again. But we all know how that ends. At the surface level, this does just kind of feel like Alan's lore written in more words, but what makes it interesting to me beyond that is the use of the character names clearly taken as alternate versions of DBD's existing characters, and this opens up a smorgasbord of questions when you remember how DBD Shared Multiverse works. The first question is pretty obvious. Are Eloise, Darren, Adrian, Michelle, and the Dread meant to literally be just Elodie, Dwight, Adam, Michaela, and the Dread with different names that Alan preferred? Or are they meant to be alternate universe versions of those characters? After all, Dead by Daylight's cast of characters exist as different versions of themselves in many different universes, both fictional and real, and in at least one case, multiple versions of the same person are present in the fog at the same time. Hattie Core and her alternate version Hayley are both in the fog at once. I'm inclined to believe they're alternate universe versions of the characters we know and love. Alan didn't see Elodie and Michaela and change their names for no real reason, but instead actually saw Eloise and Michelle fighting in the fog for their lives, just like Elodie and Michaela do. He has no particular reason to change the names, meaning that this is seamless integration of DBD's licensed character IP with the alternate universe narrative that's been core to DBD's tome stories for years. But it gets better. Because yes, Alan saw these alternative universe characters in his normal life before entering the dark place. But where did those characters come from? And why did Alan end up writing about them specifically? Are they real people trapped in the fog alongside their counterparts from other worlds? Or are they just constructs who were made real by Alan writing about them in the dark place? The answer could get a little complicated, and to understand it properly, I'm going to have to talk about another character's lore for a second. One I know may draw some controversy, but it's time to talk about Skull Merchant again. I know everyone loves it when I talk about Skull Merchant, but I'm being completely sincere here when I say if we're going to understand Alan Wake's tome lore properly, the best place to look at it is Skull Merchants. Just go with me on this one, I promise it'll be worth it. Adriana's father Saita was a mangaka who started work on a manga called Soñadores Sombrios when she was young, starring the edgy and violent anti-hero the Skull Merchant. The name Soñadores Sombrios translates to Dark Dreamers from Portuguese, which combined with Saita's documented mental strain during that period of his life and the fact that his lighter manga Adivayente Crash and Burned suggests that the character of the Skull Merchant came to him all of a sudden, out of a dark dream or nightmare, which is pretty standard for the entity-related shenanigans really. We've talked before about writers in one universe seeing things in another universe and turning it into fiction, so it's implied that Saita saw the Skull Merchant doing horrible things to people and turned that into the manga he wrote. But when Adriana grew up, she used her father's manga as a rubric to base her murderous alter ego on. She dressed like the character, adopted their weaponry and mannerisms and method of killing, to relive the fantasy her father promised. She, for all intents and purposes, became her father's character. She became the Skull Merchant, and ended up being pulled into the fog to continue hunting people for all eternity under that moniker. It stands to reason, then, that the Skull Merchant that Saita saw that he turned into his manga was his daughter, receiving visions of her cruelty in the fog, similar to how Alan Wake saw a trial for himself when he was writing for Night Springs, which means Saita wrote the character of the Skull Merchant based on his own daughter, who used her father's character as the basis for her future alter ego, which would go on to inspire her father to create it. Fiction becomes reality, which becomes fiction, but that just leaves the question, who created the Skull Merchant in the first place?
This is called The bootstrap paradox. Google it.
It's a classic bootstrap paradox, the creative work inspiring its own creation, and Alan Wake's tome lore can be interpreted the same way. When Alan Wake writes the Dead of Night script in the Dark Place, the characters he writes start to live. But back in the past, when Alan was writing for Night Springs, he'd already seen those characters living. He didn't need to bring them to life because he was writing the story of what was really happening to them. So when he sat down to write Dead of Night into existence, he was creating another bootstrap paradox. He was rewriting the story because he was inspired to write it in the first place by the story he'd rewritten and brought to life in the Dark Place that he rewrote because he'd initially written it based off the events he brought to life with the rewrite. So the whole story leaves us with one big question. Where did Dead of Night actually come from? And then a move so painfully, beautifully on brand for Alan Wake, we don't have a clear-cut answer. I suppose this is the best way an Alan Wake tome could have gone. Not an examination of a character who, let's be honest, was never going to be examined better in this lore than he has been in Alan Wake 2, but with the absolutely seamless melding of two games with very complicated timelines and lore, with an end result that leaves you begrudgingly accepting the fact that we don't have all the answers. Even disregarding things like the model that for all intents and purposes may have been ripped straight from the game. The voice lines by Matthew Peretta that convey the horrified desperation of the trials far more effectively than any voice lines we've seen before. And a bunch of thematic perks to boot. I would say Alan Wake, by virtue of his lore alone, is the best licensed survival we've ever had, and everything else about his incredible integration into the game is really just icing on the cake to me. We have one more original chapter left of Year 8 of Dead by Daylight, but after the arrival of Alan Wake, just a few weeks before the PTB, that's leaving a hell of an act to follow. Well, that's everything I have to say about Alan Wake, a character and a game series that's become pretty close to my heart in a fairly short period of time. I think players are really sleeping on some of his perks, but let me know what you think in the comments. And while you're down there, do feel free to do a bit of subscribing if you haven't done so already, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next upload, which will be coming very, very soon. Patrons get to see these videos early, so if you feel like tossing a coin to your lore guy and getting some early access to videos plus finding out the sweet perks, then you take a look at the Patreon link in the description as well. It'd be much appreciated and very excellent of you to do so. And on that note, I guess I'll see you in the next video, so ta-ta for now.
Dive in deep